Maria was born in 1989 and she grew up in Puerto Rico. Her early life was a happy childhood, beautiful as a little girl, enjoyed her high school years. Lots of freckles as she got older.
Maria's parents divorced when she was a little bit younger, and it was definitely difficult for her.
She was sort of devastated, and that was kind of her goal, is to marry the love of her life and never have to divorce ever.
Maria was going to nursing school in Puerto Rico when she met Joel. She fell in love, of course, and kind of got swept off her feet. She saw a life and a future with Joel.
She was enamored because he gave her so much attention. Her sister and her father had some cautions because of his age. He was 10 years older than her, but Maria saw someone who had set goals and dreams, and he sold those dreams to her.
Maria and Joel were married back in 2010. It was a beautiful occasion. Maria looked beautiful.
Maria and Joel had goals to come to the mainland.
Joel was training to become a CRNA, which is a certified registered nurse anesthetist.
You're not trained as a doctor, it's not as much schooling, but the pay is very high. Maria and Joel were excited to welcome their first son into the world. He was a beautiful little boy.
That was something that Maria was over the moon about. Her calling was to be a mother.
Joel had a very good paying job, and that enabled Maria to be able to stay at home, which she enjoyed, devoting her time to her firstborn son. Maria and I first met at a ladies' night. There was a woman on our church that hosted a ladies' bowling night. So we met at one of those arcades. She looked at me and she said, "So you're the pastor's wife?" And I said, "Well, yes, I am." And she said, "So tell me about God." We became friends right away, and we just never looked back.
I'm like freaking out here.
When I first met Maria, I thought she was incredibly bubbly. She was very happy, very animated, incredibly warm and friendly. You could tell she was wholly in love with her husband, loved her little family. She was devoted. She loved being a wife. Maria and Joel seemed to be in a loving marriage. You could have fun with them. Joel appeared to be a supportive and proud dad and engaged dad. 2017, Maria had gotten pregnant, and very shortly after, she had had a miscarriage. And this was really difficult for Maria.
Joel didn't really understand what happened and thought somehow that the miscarriage was her fault. And that didn't help her state of mind. Maria was so excited to be pregnant again, just a short time after her miscarriage. You could just see a glow about her while she was pregnant.
Maria had her second son in 2018, and she was ecstatic.
Joel seemed excited, but this is a time where she started to feel some distance. He started to be more secretive, and that sort of made her nervous that maybe she was doing something wrong.
At this point in Maria's life, what she wanted was to feel the completion of her family, but Joel was nowhere to be seen. Joel had a 5-year goal that he obsessively spoke about, and so he devoted himself to work, took overtime whenever he could.
Maria talked about a lot of the changes going on in Joel's life. She kept saying that he's so different now that they moved to Laredo. He started bulking up so fast that it seemed abnormal to me. Both of us suspected there was some supplements going on, probably a lot of testosterone.
At this point, Joel's priorities appeared incredibly vain to me and short-sighted. His goals were money and his figure, his body.
In January of 2019, Joel asked for a break from their marriage. He just was not happy with the way things were going. And so he decided he was just gonna move out and stay with a friend. And that was a really hard time for her. But she would often tell me that she had 10 good years of marriage and she didn't want to throw it away, all because of this 1 year where he's just acting insane.
Her goal was always for her family to stay together no matter what, because the divorce between her parents had been so devastating.
I want to support him. Be his rock. Because I know he needs it.
Maria liked to keep a journal. When Joel started being more distant, it really helped her to get her thoughts on paper.
How can I support someone who's always making me small? A piece of nothing. Not enough.
At the point that Maria and Joel were separated, he would come home to spend a little bit of time not just with her, but with the boys.
He would expect her to still wash his clothes, and he would convince her that they needed to have sex to continue to protect the marriage. I told her that it's not your job to do his laundry, and it's definitely not your job to be intimate with him while he's breaking up the marriage. In March of 2019, Maria was doing his laundry. She found a plane ticket. She never even knew he went to Spain. She just knew in her heart that something was terribly wrong and he had not been honest at all during this whole time. Maria finally worked up the courage to confront Joel about this plane ticket.
Joel admitted to having an affair. She was a nurse at one of the hospitals that he was working at.
Her name was Janet Arredondo, and he had taken her on a trip to Spain. Maria was devastated, but at the same time, I think she expected this answer.
At this point, Joel broke down. He told Maria that he wanted to keep his family, he wanted to be with her, he would break up with the girlfriend. True to Maria, she gave Joel another chance. She would do anything to get her family back.
It seemed like such a back and forth during that time that Joel would tell her one weekend that he stopped the affair, and then a couple days later he would change his tune and walk back out. He wanted both women, and so the only way to get that was to string both of them along. And that was really just almost too much for her to bear.
My experience with Joel was that he was emotionally abusive. Joel was confident, what I perceived as narcissistic, and he was kind of domineering. He was like a dominant authority in the household.
One day, I was with Maria at the coffee shop, and Joel agreed to meet her there. When we were in line, there was a guy that sort of hit on her. Joel was extremely agitated, angry, and vividly upset that someone had hit on his wife. When he started to get angry with her, I told him that he had no right to tell her that she was wearing the wrong thing or that she invited the attention when he was having an affair with another woman. I am a bolder personality than Maria was, and he started to get nervous of the influence that me and her other friends had on her, that she might become bold one day. He started to discourage her from seeing me.
Maria loved Jesus so much, and she didn't want to break up her family for fear of God. What I told her was that biblically, he had gotten to the point where she had every right to leave the marriage.
Don't put that on me.
What are you talking about?
There was a argument that they had in the car at one point, and Maria recorded it unbeknownst to Joel.
What? Because it feels like you're like, okay, look, if I stay in the house, I'm gonna be frustrated. Frustration led me to be unfaithful to you in the past.
Maybe.
No, it led me.
Maybe.
You said it.
Because I think
Okay.
that
So
possibly.
Okay.
Maria was talking to Joel about his unfaithfulness.
What do you have to say?
Nothing.
So what do you want me to do with that?
With what?
With nothing.
I don't know. It's up to you.
No, Papa. You walk out that door, we're getting a divorce.
All right, fine. You got it.
I have to realize that Joel that I knew and fell in love with isn't the Joel I am dealing with. I love him, but I don't need to accept none of this.
In the summer of 2020, Maria was beginning to see that there might not be a future with Joel.
Maria finally realized that Joel was not getting better. He wasn't getting rid of his affair, and he wasn't going to stop the lying and the dishonesty. And I think she finally started to picture a life without him. She wanted to be independent. Maria had the goal of becoming a nurse in Texas. She needed to pass her nursing exam to get her degree.
She was making plans to be able to provide for the children on her own.
Take 1,000.
She had hobbies and things she enjoyed doing.
I have been wanting to do a YouTube channel for quite a while.
She was doing hair and makeup tutorials.
I would probably grab like a little bit by little. Maybe that can help you, Gabby.
She was so beautiful in the way that she would play around with her makeup.
Whew, I like it. Just makes you look more awake. There's nothing like a good mascara and a good bronzer to make you feel good, right?
In September of 2020, Maria found Joel's phone and was able to access a bunch of messages between him and Janet. Really just showed her that he was in a full-blown affair and they were having sex.
That was the moment that she saw it with her own eyes, and that her very, very determined spirit came out.
Maria confronted Joel, and I think Joel started to see a different Maria. She was saying, hey, I'm done, and I'm not gonna listen to your lies anymore. So he told her, I'm gonna stop seeing Janet for real this time. We're gonna move to Dallas, and that will prove to you that I'm willing to put her away. Maria was skeptical, but at the same time, he had never offered to move away from his girlfriend before. Part of her wanted to believe that it could be true. Maria was very excited to tell me about how their marriage was going to turn around, and so we agreed to meet. However, before she came to my house, she gave me a phone call and said that she was going to be late. And she said, I called Joel and I heard a dog barking in the background, and I think it was Janet's. I think he lied to me again. I'm going to stop by the house and just make sure. I told her that I didn't think it was wise for her to stop over there, that nothing good was gonna come from it, but she said she just couldn't help herself, she had to. When Maria arrived at Janet's house, she saw that his car was there. She got out of the car and decided to confront them both. When Maria arrived at Janet's house and saw that Joel's car was there, she was very angry. She had just been played again. Janet used the Ring app to kind of talk to her and say that she needed to leave right away or she would call the police.
Maria was incredibly upset and wasn't going to go anywhere until she had spoken to her husband. When Joel finally emerges, he tells Maria that he's chosen Janet, and I can't even imagine what was going through her head when hours earlier he had been telling a different story.
Joel told Maria to go get in the car and that they would drive to the park and they would just hash it out. When Maria and Joel were at the park, he got so angry that he smashed her windshield with his fist, and it just shattered. Meanwhile, Janet called the police. The police responded fairly quickly.
Hello, ma'am, did you call police?
Yes, I did.
What's going on? You gotta get up. What happened?
I had a woman come by that she was already told not to be here, so I had already filed a...
Trespass warning?
Yes.
Okay.
She was here, she was asked to leave, she refused, so I told you guys.
Let me make a phone call then, and hopefully she'll answer. If not, well, that's the only way I can warn her.
Hey, I'm talking to you right now. Hang up the phone.
I guess that's your boyfriend.
They called Maria, and Joel, you can hear him screaming. He couldn't believe she answered the phone while they were talking.
Your call has been forwarded to an automatic voice message system.
I'm gonna try one more time.
Janet started texting Joel to be quiet, to let him know it was the police calling.
Hello?
Oh, yes, sir, I'm looking for Maria Munoz.
Yeah, she's here. I'm having a conversation with her.
All right, this is Officer Jalomo Laredo PD, sir.
Yeah,
I'm calling on behalf of Janetta Redondo. Can I speak to her?
sure.
Thank you.
After receiving the text from Janet, Joel knew it was going to be the police, and instantly he was a calm, collected person.
Hello.
Yes, Miss Munoz. Man, this officer Jaloma Laredo PD.
Yes.
Okay, I understand you came over to Ms. Arredondo's house earlier today. Okay, I'm gonna ask you to not return. If not, you will be placed into custody.
Okay.
After the police hung up with her, Maria drove over to my house. She was very upset. She was almost hysterical. She told me that she was finally ready to move on, for real this time. No more getting lied to. I saw her the next day at church, and even though she was sad, she was determined that this was the thing that she had to do. Later that day, she sent him a text and let him know she was not going to go after him anymore. She let him know that for them to be legally separated, an attorney needed to be involved in that.
Joel's response was that he didn't want any lawyers involved. His concern lied in finances. He really didn't want Maria to go through with it because that would cost him.
He had responded initially on Sunday, but then on Monday, he had a different response, and he sent it through email. Again, he gave implication that there was hope for their marriage. I didn't believe any of it, and yet somehow I could not convince her to say no to this meeting. They agreed to meet around 7, and I told her to contact me as soon as he arrived, as soon as he left. She agreed to do that. I believe it was 9:30 when I had not heard from her. He showed up already much later than he was supposed to. He should have been gone by then. I started to pray that the conversation would go well.
There, 911 with the address of emergency.
And kind of scared that she's not breathing.
There, 911 with the address of emergency.
And kind of scared if she's not breathing. She may have taken some pills.
Okay, sir. And do you know what kind of pills they were?
Yeah, clonazepam.
On September 22nd, 2020, the Laredo Police Department received a 911 call for unresponsive female. I was the first officer on scene. So as I approached the house, I see a male subject at the doorway.
What's going on?
He just turns around and bolts right into the residence.
What's going on?
So I followed quickly behind him.
What's going on?
His name was Joel Peor. Female is his wife, Maria Munoz.
What'd she take?
I think clonazepam. But she's been pretty depressed lately.
I hear the paramedics, the ambulance get to the scene. They had their lights and sirens. Paramedics continued CPR, and I see no changes in her body. She's not getting any better.
Under control.
No, she's not. She's been down for a while.
The paramedics on scene determined that Maria was deceased at 1:50 a.m.
That's fine. Confirmed 82. What's going on? What happened?
I started getting very suspicious about Joel. His pupils are just really big. I see that he's sweating profusely.
Let's have a seat over here.
She's been super depressed. I've been ignoring her. we're going through some problems. And I came to talk to her, like we were just talking.
So you're not staying here right now?
I'm like, this doesn't make sense. If he doesn't live here, what is he doing here at 1 o'clock in the morning?
We had sex, we took a shower, and I thought she was like knocked out. I didn't think anything of it, so just kept on doing my thing. And then I go back upstairs, and then she just...
He starts crying, but it's a really fake cry. It didn't add up to me. I didn't like where it was going.
No, it's 37. Yeah, it's really 37.
I told him that this is very 37, which means suspicious in police jargon.
We gotta talk to you, okay? Come on, you gotta go outside.
So I arrived at the scene shortly after 2 a.m. Once I got the authorization and consent to go into the home, I did do a brief walkthrough. I see Maria, her body is there. Joelle insinuated that she had overdosed on a bottle of pills, bottle of clonazepam. Whenever somebody takes a bottle of pills, they foam from the mouth. I noticed that Maria was not foaming from the mouth. When they did the examination of Maria's body, my partners discovered a track mark, or like a puncture, on her arm. It looked like she had just gone to get her blood drawn. And then they also discovered a bag of medical supplies. Inside that bag were needles, catheters, and 4 to 5 bottles of medications. I immediately suspected that there was more to this than what Joelle was saying. We transported Joelle to the police department. It was a voluntary interview. When I arrived at the station, I could hear him screaming. So much so that I had to tell the officer to tell him to calm down. When I entered the room, my interview at that point was that of a grieving spouse.
What's going on, man? I'm really depressed because so that we got separated.
Joelle wanted to make it clear that Maria was depressed and was not taking the separation well.
So you said that Maria was taking pills for depression. Were they prescribed to her? Yeah, they were. And hers ran out, so mine were recently given to me. So I just went to give her some. Yeah, 1 milligram clonazepam.
According to Joelle, he had a prescription bottle for the same type of medication. So he allowed Maria to take some of his pills.
And I checked my pills, 2 pills. You know, she took 4.
He wanted me to think that Maria was so depressed that she had taken a bottle of clonazepam and that she committed suicide.
I saw a track mark on her. Okay. Did she inject herself with anything that you know of? Would she inject herself with anything? And if she did, what would it be? You know? Did you inject her tonight? No. With anything? No.
By the end of that interview, I didn't suspect that Maria had taken any pills. When we looked at the needle puncture wound, the medical equipment at home, I suspected that Joelle, with his knowledge of anesthesia, had killed his wife. So at the end of that interview, Joelle was released. There was no evidence to charge him.
When the police told me they were doing a suicide investigation, I told them that was impossible.
I knew that she would never do such a thing because she had plans for the future. She had plans for her life.
The key piece of evidence that was pending for us to rule out suicide, to rule out overdose, was a toxicology report.
As soon as we received that, we knew what caused her death.
The toxicology report routinely takes a few months. And in January 2021, we received the report.
The first thing we looked was to see how much clonazepam she had. And it was striking that she didn't have any clonazepam in her system.
1 milligram of clonazepam.
He said clonazepam, and she had none in her system. So then we reviewed the other drugs that were in her system. It was Versed, ketamine, and morphine. Propofol, Narcan, lidocaine, and Demerol.
So all these drugs, what they have in common is that they're normally used for anesthesia. I was familiar with propofol because that's known as what ultimately killed Michael Jackson.
Propofol takes effect immediately. The second it hits your bloodstream, you fall asleep. So it's impossible for you to self-administer propofol. Someone else has to administer propofol. So we knew it was not an overdose. We believed that we had the proof to show murder.
We're the police, or we're gonna break down the door. Go ahead and grab me back. Joel Peyote was arrested and charged with the murder officially on January 16th, 2021.
Joel Peyote's trial started March 20th of 2023. The defense argued that Maria was a drug abuser who committed suicide because she was so depressed, and that Joel gave Maria an injection in an attempt to revive her. Maria's journals were critical to the case, so we could refute that she was suicidal.
Today my head will not look down. Today I will conquer. Today I am free. I am strong. I am confident. I am enough.
When I testified in court, I was able to read the journals to the jury and mention to the jury that suicide and depression had no bearing on this case whatsoever.
With all the accusations flying about suicide or trying to smear her, Maria was able to speak for herself on how she felt, what she thought, and share the hope that she had.
I love my life. I love who I am becoming.
Joel couldn't steal her voice from her like he thought he had. And it was beautiful.
It was important to give as much background information as we could to explain Joel and Maria's relationship. The prosecution team brought in a video that Maria had recorded without Joel knowing.
You walk out that door, we're getting a door.
We believed it was important to show that he's pretty cold about the pain that she's experiencing. We explained to the jury that on September 21st, 2020, Joel Peyote arrived to Maria's home with a bag of anesthetic drugs and IV equipment. He was wearing his scrubs because he had been at the hospital. So the evidence showed that she had high levels of caffeine in her system. We were able to describe to the jury that he probably showed up with a cup of coffee, and in that coffee, he likely included the oral anesthetic drugs, which is the ketamine, the Versed, and the morphine. And that would have incapacitated her. She would not have been able to resist him trying to put an IV on her to give her the additional drugs, lidocaine, propofol, Narcan, and Demerol. The levels of anesthetic drugs in her system were enough for 2 major surgeries. Joel knew that this was going to end her life.
And we are here for Maria Munoz, who wrote, "No matter what happens, I will be fine. I will not let
Put my head down. I will hold it high. I am unique. No one is me, and that is my superpower. I am enough, and all I need. I will always push and thrive. I will shine bright like a diamond in the sky. The woman who never gave up. Maria."
Joel Peyo was found guilty of murder and of tampering with the evidence.
When Joel finally was convicted of murder, I was so relieved. I was grateful for Maria to get justice, but I was sad for her children.
I don't think that Joel has any real remorse for what he did. I think that he's a narcissist and a manipulator.
On a quiet evening in Charleston, South Carolina, a simple argument unfolded on a residential street. There was nothing about the moment that suggested history was about to be made. No one standing nearby knew that the next few minutes would leave a family shattered, a neighborhood searching for answers, and a community forced to confront a painful reality about violence that could erupt without warning. It was August 8, 2019. The sun had already disappeared from the sky, leaving behind the familiar sounds of an ordinary neighborhood. Cars moved through the streets. Lights glowed from homes. People continued with their routines, unaware that just outside a house on Hanover Street, a confrontation was beginning that would never be forgotten by those who lived through it. For Timothy Heyman Jr., that night was supposed to be just another night. He was 41 years old. He was a father. He was someone who was known by the people around him, not as a name in a police report, not as a headline, but as a person with memories, relationships, and a life that mattered to those who loved him. But in a matter of moments, everything changed. A disagreement that began between 2 people escalated into something irreversible. Words turned into anger. Anger turned into violence. And before anyone could stop what was happening, Timothy Heyman Jr. was left fighting for his life outside his own home. The most haunting part of this case is not only the loss of a man, but the speed at which that loss happened. A human life can be built over decades. Years of childhood memories. Friendships formed. Lessons learned. Struggles overcome. Moments shared with family. For Timothy, those 41 years represented a story that was still being written. But violence does not measure time. It does not consider birthdays that will never arrive, conversations that will never happen, or a child who will grow up without the presence of a father. It happens in a single moment. And for the people closest to Timothy Heyman Jr., that moment began with something that many communities know all too well, a conflict that should have ended with words, but instead ended with tragedy. The East Side neighborhood of Charleston had seen its share of challenges. Like many urban communities, it carried both beauty and pain. Families lived side by side. Neighbors knew each other. Children played in streets that held generations of memories. But beneath that everyday life existed another reality: concerns about violence, fear of gunfire, and the heartbreaking possibility that another family could lose someone they loved. When the news spread that Timothy had been shot, disbelief moved quickly through the neighborhood. For some residents, the tragedy felt like another painful reminder of a problem they had been warning about for years. For others, it felt impossible to accept that a familiar face, someone who had walked those streets and shared those spaces, was suddenly gone. A place that had been ordinary only hours earlier became a crime scene. The street where people once parked their cars and greeted their neighbors became the location where investigators searched for answers. The home that represented safety and family became connected forever to a moment of fear and loss. And as police began piecing together what happened, one question remained at the center of everything. How did a confrontation between two people become a murder? Investigators would later discover that the answer was hidden in the final moments before the shooting. A nearby surveillance camera captured parts of the encounter, preserving fragments of a tragedy that might otherwise have been impossible to fully understand. In many cases, investigators are left with uncertainty. They must rely on memories that can fade, witnesses who may have seen only pieces of what happened, and evidence that may never reveal the complete truth. But in Timothy Hayman Jr.'s case, technology became a silent witness. The camera could not explain emotions. It could not reveal every thought that passed through the minds of those involved. It could not bring Timothy back. But it could show investigators what happened when a tense encounter crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. As detectives examined the evidence, they began building a timeline. They looked at what happened before the shooting, what happened during those critical seconds, and what happened afterward when the person responsible left the scene. The investigation would eventually lead authorities to a suspect named John Johnson. But before there were arrests, before there were courtroom arguments, and before the public knew the full details of the case, there was only a grieving family trying to understand how their loved one had been taken away. For Timothy's family, the pain was not only in losing him. It was in knowing that the future they imagined with him would never exist. There would be moments when someone would want to call him and remember he was no longer there. There would be celebrations where his absence would feel louder than the conversations around them. There would be a child growing older without the guidance, protection, and love of a father. Every murder creates a second tragedy that happens away from the crime scene. The first tragedy is the moment a life is taken. The second is everything that happens afterward, the empty chair, the unanswered questions, the memories that become the only remaining connection to someone who is gone. Timothy Hayman Jr.'s death was not just a statistic. It was not simply another case number added to a growing list of violent crimes. It was the end of a person's journey and the beginning of a family's lifelong struggle to live with what happened. As investigators continued their work, they would uncover details that showed how modern technology, surveillance footage, witness accounts, and digital evidence could transform a criminal investigation. But behind every piece of evidence was a human story. Behind every photograph was a moment from someone's life. Behind every police report was a family waiting for justice. The case of Timothy Hayman Jr. is a reminder of how fragile ordinary moments can be. A person can leave home expecting another normal evening and never return to the life they knew. A conversation can become a confrontation. A confrontation can become a tragedy. And a few minutes can change everything. This is the story of Timothy Hayman Jr., a father, a neighbor, and a man whose life ended far too soon. This is the story of what happened on Hanover Street, the investigation that followed, and the search for justice after a single act of violence took away a life and left an entire community asking the same question. Could this have been prevented? Charleston, South Carolina, is a city where history seems to exist in every corner. Its streets carry stories from centuries past. The old buildings, the quiet neighborhoods, and the coastal air create an image of a place connected to tradition and memory. Tourists often see Charleston as a city of beautiful architecture, historic landmarks, and southern charm. But beyond the streets that appear on postcards, there are communities with their own struggles, their own battles, and their own stories that rarely receive attention until tragedy forces the outside world to look closer. The East Side neighborhood was one of those places. Located near the heart of Charleston, the East Side was a community shaped by generations of families who had lived, worked, and built their lives there. It was a place where neighbors recognized familiar faces, where people knew the sounds of the streets around them, and where the history of the area was carried not only through buildings, but through the memories of the people who called it home. Like many neighborhoods across America, the East Side contained contradictions. There was pride. There was resilience. There was a strong sense of community. But there were also challenges that had followed the area for years. Economic struggles, concerns about crime, and repeated incidents of violence created an atmosphere where some residents felt they were constantly trying to protect the place they loved. For many people living there, violence was not an abstract idea seen only on the evening news. It was something that could appear unexpectedly, sometimes only a few steps away from someone's front door. And that was what made the death of Timothy Hayman Jr. so painful. He was not killed in some distant location, unknown to the people around him. He was killed in a place connected to his everyday life. A street where people lived. A neighborhood where families woke up, went to work, raised children, and tried to create normal lives. Hanover Street was not supposed to become the center of a murder investigation. It was supposed to be just another street in Charleston. On August 8, 2019, however, that changed. The area around Hanover Street became frozen in time. A place where neighbors had once walked casually became a location surrounded by police activity, questions, and uncertainty. For investigators arriving at the scene, every detail mattered. A street can appear ordinary, but after a violent crime, every small piece of information can become important. The position of a vehicle. The location of a witness. The angle of a surveillance camera. The movements of people before and after the incident. A murder scene is not only where a victim is found. It is a place where a story has been interrupted, and investigators must carefully reconstruct the missing chapters. The challenge in cases like Timothy Hayman Jr.'s is that violence rarely begins at the moment a weapon is used. The final seconds are only the end of a much longer sequence. There are decisions made before that moment. Emotions building before that moment. Words spoken before that moment. A person does not suddenly arrive at the final act without a chain of events leading there. For Timothy, that chain began with an interaction that investigators would later examine closely. What caused the disagreement? What was said between the two men? Was there a history between them? Could someone have walked away before the situation became deadly? These questions would become central to understanding the case. But before investigators could answer them, they first needed to understand the people involved. They needed to understand Timothy Hayman Jr. Because every investigation begins with evidence, but every tragedy begins with a person. In the days after his death, residents and loved ones described Timothy as someone who was known around the community. He was not a stranger passing through. He had connections. He had relationships. He had people who expected to see him again. He had a life outside the headlines. He had routines. He had memories. He had people who depended on him. That is often the hardest reality for communities after a violent crime. The public may quickly learn the basic facts: a name, an age, a location, a date. But those details only describe the ending. They do not describe the person. They do not explain the jokes they told, the conversations they had, the small habits that made them unique, or the role they played in the lives of others. The investigation into Timothy's death would eventually focus on evidence and accountability. But before there could be justice, there had to be recognition of what had been lost. A man had been taken from his family. A father had been taken from his child. A neighbor had been taken from his community. And in the East Side neighborhood, people were left facing a painful reality. Another act of violence had created another empty space where someone's life used to be. The reaction from residents reflected more than grief. It reflected exhaustion. Many communities affected by repeated violence experience a complicated mixture of emotions. There is anger because someone has been harmed. There is sadness because another life has been lost. There is fear because people wonder who might be next. And there is often frustration because the warning signs of violence can feel familiar. Residents had previously expressed concerns about safety in the area. They wanted their streets to be places where children could grow up without fear, where families could gather without worrying about sudden danger. The death of Timothy Heyman Jr. brought those concerns back into public conversation. Local leaders and community members began discussing what could be done to address violence and prevent future tragedies. But for Timothy's family, conversations about statistics and public safety could never replace the person they had lost. A community may debate causes. A city may discuss solutions. Law enforcement may build a case. But a family experiences the absence of one specific person. One voice. One smile. One father. One son. One human being. As the investigation moved forward, the quiet streets of Hanover Street became the beginning of a complex search for answers. Detectives would study the evidence left behind. They would examine the moments before the shooting and the actions afterward. They would follow the trail that led away from the crime scene. And eventually, they would identify a suspect. But before that happened, the city of Charleston had to confront a difficult question. Why did a disagreement between two people end with a man losing his life? The answer would not only determine what happened to Timothy Heyman Jr., but would also reveal a larger story about anger, decisions, and the devastating consequences of a single moment. Because in the end, this case was not only about the person who pulled the trigger. It was about the person who never came home. It was about the family left behind. It was about a neighborhood forced to remember that behind every crime scene is a human story waiting to be told. And that story begins with Timothy Heyman Jr. before his name appeared in news reports, before investigators studied his final moments, before a community gathered to mourn him. Timothy Heyman Jr. was simply a man living his life. He was not a case file. He was not a crime scene. He was not a photograph attached to a tragic headline. He was Timothy. A father. A friend. A neighbor. A person with his own history, his own struggles, his own memories, and his own hopes for the future. When a person becomes the victim of a violent crime, the world often learns about them through the final chapter of their life. The public hears about what happened to them, but rarely hears enough about who they were before that moment. But understanding a victim means looking beyond the tragedy. It means asking a different question. Not only, how did Timothy Heyman Jr. die? But also, how did Timothy Heyman Jr. live? The answer to that question reveals why his death affected so many people. Timothy was 41 years old when his life was taken away. At an age when many people are still building their future, he had already experienced the responsibilities and challenges that come with adulthood. He understood the importance of family. He understood the value of hard work. He understood what it meant to continue moving forward even when life was not always easy. People who knew Timothy described him as someone with a personality that made him memorable. He was known as a person who could bring energy into a room, someone who had a sense of humor and a way of connecting with those around him. For some people, he was the person they could talk to after a difficult day. For others, he was someone they could count on. For his family, he was something much more. He was home. He was part of the everyday moments that often seem ordinary until they disappear forever. The conversations. The laughter. The small interactions that families rarely realize they are collecting as memories until there are no more new ones being created. Timothy was also a father. That role shaped an important part of who he was. A child does not measure a parent's importance through public achievements or material things. A child remembers presence. They remember the sound of a parent's voice. They remember moments of attention. They remember knowing that someone is there for them. For Timothy's daughter, the loss was not only about losing someone she loved. It was about losing the future moments that would never happen. The advice he would never give. The milestones he would never witness. The conversations they would never share. A father's absence can be felt in moments that are years away. Graduations. Birthdays. Important decisions. Times when a child simply wants to hear the voice of someone who has always been there. Those are the invisible consequences of violent crime. The damage does not end when the police leave the scene. It continues through the years that follow. Before becoming known as a victim, Timothy had built a life through work and determination. He had experience in different fields, including working as a chef and caring for animals. These jobs reflected different sides of him. Working as a chef requires patience, focus, and the ability to handle pressure. A kitchen can be intense. Orders come quickly. Mistakes happen. People depend on each other to keep everything moving. Caring for animals requires another kind of responsibility. It requires patience and compassion. Animals depend on people who are willing to provide care even when there is no recognition or reward. These parts of Timothy's life showed a person who was familiar with responsibility. He was someone who contributed. Someone who worked. Someone who had relationships with people around him. His life was not defined by the moment that ended it. But tragedy has a way of reducing complicated human beings into simple descriptions. Victim. Suspect. Crime scene. Evidence. Court documents. Those words may be necessary for an investigation, but they cannot capture a person's entire existence. Timothy Heyman Jr. was more than the circumstances of his death. He had a past before August 8, 2019. He had people who knew him before police officers arrived. He had moments of happiness that would never appear in an official report. He had ordinary days that mattered because they belonged to him. And that is what makes cases like this so painful. The violence itself happens quickly. But the life that is lost represents decades. 41 years of experiences disappeared in a single night. For the people who loved Timothy, the hardest part was likely not only understanding what happened, but accepting that life had changed permanently. There would be no final goodbye. No chance to prepare. No opportunity to make peace with the loss. Just a sudden absence. A person who was there one moment and gone the next. In the aftermath, family members and friends were forced to confront a reality that no one expects to face. The world continues moving forward even when someone's personal world has stopped. Cars still drive down the same streets. People still go to work. Stores still open. Days continue. But for those grieving, time feels different. A single date becomes permanently marked. August 8, 2019. A day that separates life into two parts. Before Timothy was killed. And after. The community response showed that Timothy's life had touched more people than just his immediate family. When residents gathered to remember him, they were not only mourning a crime victim. They were mourning a neighbor. Someone whose existence had been part of their community. Someone whose story deserved to be remembered beyond the violence that took him away. The tragedy of Timothy Heyman Jr. also raised broader questions about the environment surrounding his death. How do small conflicts become deadly? Why do some moments of anger become impossible to reverse? How does a disagreement transform into a decision that destroys multiple lives at once? These questions would become central as investigators examined the events leading up to the shooting. Because every act of violence has a moment before it happens. A moment when choices still exist. A moment when someone can walk away. A moment when a different decision could change everything. For Timothy, that moment came and went. And afterward, only the consequences remained. His family was left with grief. His community was left with fear and frustration. Investigators were left with the responsibility of uncovering the truth. But before the world knew the details of the case, before the courtroom arguments and evidence presentations, there was a simple truth that could never be ignored. Timothy Heyman Jr. was a person whose life had value. He was someone who mattered. An understanding that is the first step in understanding the tragedy that unfolded on Hanover Street. Because every true crime story begins with a crime. But every victim story begins long before that. It begins with a life. Part 4, The Incident, the night a conversation turned into a tragedy. The evening of August 8, 2019, began like many other nights in Charleston. There was no warning that the ordinary rhythm of life on Hanover Street was about to be interrupted by violence. The neighborhood continued moving through its familiar routine. People were inside their homes. Others were outside, moving through the streets they knew so well. The sounds of everyday life continued, unaware that within a short amount of time, one family would receive news that would permanently change their lives. For Timothy Heyman Jr., the night started as a normal moment. He was near his home, in the neighborhood where he lived and where many people knew him. There was nothing unusual about being outside. There was nothing unusual about seeing another person and having a conversation. But somewhere between one moment and the next, something changed. A conversation became an argument. An argument became a confrontation. And that confrontation ended with a gunshot. The details surrounding those final moments would later become the focus of a police investigation. Detectives would attempt to reconstruct every second, every movement, and every decision that led to Timothy's death. Because in a case like this, the most important question is not only what happened. It is how it happened. What caused the situation to escalate? What was said between the two men? What emotions were present during those final moments? And most importantly, what made someone decide that violence was the answer? According to investigators, Timothy became involved in a dispute with another man outside his home on Hanover Street. At first, the encounter appeared to be a confrontation between two individuals. Like many conflicts that happen every day, it may have begun with words. Words can carry weight. They can reveal anger. They can expose old disagreements. They can create tension that builds quietly until one moment causes everything to explode. A disagreement does not always look dangerous in its earliest stages. Two people may stand facing each other. Voices may rise. Emotions may intensify. To someone watching from a distance, it may appear like a situation that will eventually calm down. But sometimes, hidden beneath those moments, there is a dangerous combination of anger, pride, frustration, and poor decisions. And once a weapon enters that situation, the outcome can change forever. The confrontation involving Timothy Heyman Jr. was captured in part by nearby surveillance footage. That footage would later become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the investigation. A camera positioned in the area became a silent witness. It could not speak. It could not explain what the people involved were thinking. It could not describe the emotions behind the argument. But it preserved a sequence of events that investigators could carefully examine. For law enforcement, those images represented something incredibly valuable. Time. A timeline. A way to look back at the moments before tragedy occurred. The footage showed an interaction that escalated until the situation reached a deadly point. Investigators believed that the man involved in the confrontation with Timothy eventually pulled out a firearm and shot him. In an instant, everything changed. A life that had existed for 41 years was suddenly placed in danger. The person who had been standing outside his home only moments earlier became the victim of a violent act. The suspect then left the scene, reportedly leaving the area on a bicycle. That moment after a shooting is often one of the most revealing parts of an investigation. The actions taken immediately afterward can tell investigators a great deal. Did someone attempt to help? Did someone call for emergency assistance? Did someone stay at the scene? Or did someone run? Leaving a crime scene creates a new series of questions. Where did the person go? Why did they leave? What were they trying to avoid? As officers arrived at Hanover Street, they were confronted with the reality of what had happened. A man had been shot. Neighbors who had been living ordinary lives suddenly found themselves surrounded by police activity and confusion. The street became a place of urgency. Emergency responders worked to provide medical assistance, but Timothy's injuries were too severe. Despite efforts to save him, Timothy Heyman Jr. did not survive. For the officers and first responders who arrived, the scene represented another difficult moment in a job filled with difficult moments. They were not only responding to a crime. They were arriving at the point where one person's life had ended and many others were about to change. For Timothy's loved ones, the hours that followed were filled with the kind of questions that no family ever wants to ask. What happened? Why him? Could something have been done differently? Those questions often remain long after an investigation ends. A murder investigation can determine who is responsible, but it cannot undo the moment when a family loses someone they love. The death of Timothy Heyman Jr. became the sixth homicide recorded in Charleston during 2019, adding to growing concerns about violence in the city. For residents of the East Side community, the tragedy was not just another number. It was another reminder that violence could happen close to home. It could happen on familiar streets. It could happen to someone they knew. And it could happen in a matter of seconds. The days following the shooting would bring investigators deeper into the case. They would analyze surveillance footage, collect evidence, speak with witnesses, and begin the difficult process of identifying exactly what happened that night. But before the investigation could reveal answers, there was a moment of silence that surrounded Hanover Street. A place that had once been ordinary now carried the memory of tragedy. Neighbors looked at the area differently. The street held a story that could not be erased. A story about a disagreement that became deadly. A story about choices made in a single moment. A story about a man named Timothy Heyman Jr., whose life ended far too soon. The shooting lasted only seconds. But the consequences would last for years. For investigators, those seconds became the foundation of a murder case. For the community, they became a painful reminder of the damage caused by violence. And for Timothy's family, those seconds marked the final moment before everything changed forever, when police officers arrived at Hanover Street on August 8, 2019. They were entering a scene that would become the center of a major investigation in Charleston. Moments earlier, the area had been an ordinary neighborhood street. A place where people lived their daily lives, where homes stood quietly beside one another, and where residents expected the night to pass like any other. Now, it had become a crime scene. The transition was immediate. The familiar sounds of a neighborhood were replaced by the urgency of emergency responders. Officers moved through the area, securing the location and trying to understand what had happened. Every second mattered. Every detail mattered. Because in a homicide investigation, the first moments after a crime can determine the direction of everything that follows. Investigators know that a crime scene tells a story. Not through words, but through evidence. A position. A movement. An object left behind. A witness who remembers one important detail. A camera that captures a moment no one realized would matter. The challenge is that the story is rarely complete at first. It comes in pieces. And it is the responsibility of investigators to carefully collect those pieces and rebuild what happened. At Hanover Street, the first and most important fact was clear. Timothy Heyman Jr. had been shot. The man who had been standing outside his own home only moments before was now the victim of a deadly act of violence. Emergency responders worked quickly, but despite their efforts, Timothy did not survive. For investigators arriving at the scene, there was no longer an opportunity to prevent the tragedy. Their mission had changed. Now they had to find the person responsible. The first challenge in any shooting investigation is establishing the sequence of events. A gunshot happens quickly. The sound lasts only a moment. The action itself may take only seconds. But behind those seconds is a chain of events that must be uncovered. Who was there? Who approached? What happened before the shooting? What happened afterward? And where did the person responsible go? Detectives began gathering information from the area. They spoke with people who may have seen or heard something. They examined the surroundings. They looked for physical evidence that could connect the shooting to the person who had left the scene. But one piece of evidence would soon become especially important. A nearby surveillance camera. In modern criminal investigations, cameras have become some of the most valuable silent witnesses. They do not forget. They do not change their story. They do not become confused by fear or emotion. They simply record. The camera footage from the area provided investigators with a glimpse into the moments leading up to the shooting. It captured part of the interaction between Timothy and the other man involved. For detectives, this was a major breakthrough in understanding what happened. The footage allowed them to look beyond assumptions and focus on a recorded sequence of events. They could examine movements. They could study timing. They could observe the progression of the confrontation. A witness might remember hearing an argument. Another person might remember seeing someone leave. But video evidence could connect those details together. It could help transform scattered information into a clearer picture. The footage did not answer every question. A camera can show what happened physically, but it cannot reveal what someone was thinking. It cannot show anger building inside a person. It cannot explain why a disagreement became violent. It cannot reveal the personal history between two individuals. But it can show the moment when a situation crosses a line. And that moment became a critical part of the investigation. Along with the surveillance footage, investigators examined other forms of evidence. They collected statements from people who had knowledge of the incident. They reviewed information connected to the individuals involved. They looked at digital evidence, including information available through social media and other online sources. The modern world leaves behind traces. A person's movements, their connections, their photographs, their communications. Sometimes, those traces provide investigators with information that would have been impossible to obtain decades earlier. In Timothy Hayman Jr.'s case, technology played a major role in helping investigators understand the events surrounding his death. But evidence alone does not solve a case. Evidence must be interpreted. It must be connected. It must tell a complete story. Detectives had to determine not only what happened, but who was responsible. The person who shot Timothy had left the scene. That meant investigators needed to move quickly. Every hour after a violent crime can be important. Memories fade. Evidence can disappear. A person suspected of a crime may attempt to distance themselves from what happened. But investigators also understood that rushing could create mistakes. A criminal case must be built carefully. The goal was not simply to find someone. The goal was to find the truth. As detectives continued their work, the focus began narrowing. The confrontation outside Timothy's home was no longer just a tragic event. It was becoming a case with a timeline, evidence, and a possible suspect. The investigators were beginning to see the shape of what had happened that night. A disagreement. An escalation. A gun. A fatal shot. A person leaving the scene. But even with those pieces, important questions remained. Why did the confrontation happen? Was there a previous conflict between Timothy and the other man? Was the shooting planned, or did it happen in a moment of anger? What happened in the minutes after the gun was fired? And where was the person responsible now? For Timothy's family, those questions represented more than an investigation. They represented their search for justice. When someone is taken away suddenly, families often replay the final moments again and again. They wonder what happened. They wonder if anything could have changed the outcome. They search for meaning in a moment that seems impossible to understand. Meanwhile, investigators continued following the evidence left behind. The surveillance footage had given them a direction. Witness accounts had provided additional information. The details collected at the scene began forming a picture. And slowly, the investigation moved from uncertainty toward identification. The person responsible was no longer an unknown figure. A name would soon emerge. A suspect would soon be identified. And the case of Timothy Hayman Jr. would enter its next phase. But before that happened, detectives had to carefully examine every piece of evidence. Because one mistake could affect everything. A conviction would not come from emotion. It would come from facts. From proof. From the careful reconstruction of the final moments of Timothy's life. The street where he died had already given investigators the first clues. Now, those clues would lead them toward the person accused of taking him away. The search for answers had begun. The days after the shooting of Timothy Hayman Jr. were filled with questions. For the residents of Charleston's East Side community, there was a painful uncertainty hanging over Hanover Street. People knew that a man had lost his life. They knew that a family had been destroyed by violence. But they did not yet know exactly why it happened, or who would be held responsible. For investigators, the work had only begun. A homicide investigation is not simply about finding a person who may have committed a crime. It is about reconstructing a story from fragments. It requires patience, precision, and the ability to separate assumptions from facts. Every piece of information must be examined. Every statement must be evaluated. Every possibility must be considered. Because behind every murder case is a sequence of events that existed before the final moment. And investigators needed to uncover that sequence. The shooting of Timothy Heyman Jr. appeared to begin with a confrontation between two people. But a confrontation alone did not explain everything. Detectives needed to understand what brought those two individuals together that night. Was it a random encounter? Was there a disagreement that had existed before? Was there tension between them? Or was this a situation that exploded unexpectedly? Those questions became central to the investigation. The first major challenge was identifying the person who had been involved in the confrontation. Investigators had an important advantage that many homicide cases do not have: surveillance footage. The camera recording provided a glimpse of the moments before the shooting and helped investigators understand the movement of the people involved. In a case without video evidence, detectives often have to depend heavily on witness memories. But memories can be complicated. Fear, distance, darkness, and confusion can affect what someone believes they saw. A witness may remember a person's clothing but not their face. They may remember hearing something, but not seeing everything. They may remember the beginning of an event, but miss the most important moment. Video evidence does not replace human testimony, but it can provide a foundation. It can help investigators establish a timeline. It can confirm certain details. It can reveal information that no person could fully describe. For the detectives working on Timothy's case, the footage became a crucial piece of the puzzle. But the investigation did not stop there. Police also looked into information connected to the people involved. They examined possible relationships, backgrounds, and digital traces that could help explain what happened. The rise of social media and digital communication has changed criminal investigations forever. In the past, detectives might have searched through physical evidence, spoken with witnesses, and followed traditional investigative methods. Today, a person's online presence can sometimes reveal connections, conflicts, or information that becomes relevant to a case. Photographs, messages, online interactions, connections between individuals. All of these can become part of the larger picture. However, digital evidence must be handled carefully. A photograph does not always tell the full story. A message does not always reveal the complete context. Investigators must avoid jumping to conclusions based on incomplete information. Their responsibility is to build a case based on facts that can withstand examination. As detectives continued working, the focus began moving toward a possible suspect. The name that emerged was John Johnson. Authorities believed Johnson was the person involved in the confrontation with Timothy Heyman Jr. and later charged him in connection with the shooting. But identifying a suspect is only the beginning. An accusation is not the same as proof. A criminal case must be supported by evidence strong enough to demonstrate what happened beyond a reasonable doubt. This is where many investigations become complicated. A person may be suspected. A timeline may appear clear. A community may believe they know the answer. But the justice system requires something more. It requires evidence. It requires witnesses. It requires a case that can be tested in court. Investigators continued gathering information that could connect Johnson to the crime. They examined the surveillance footage. They reviewed witness statements. They considered physical and digital evidence. Each piece added another part to the story. Meanwhile, Timothy's family and friends were waiting. For them, the investigation was not simply a legal process. It was the search for accountability after an unimaginable loss. Every day without answers could feel like another reminder of what had happened. The world continued moving forward, but their lives remained connected to the moment Timothy was taken away. For the community, the investigation also carried importance beyond one person. Residents wanted justice for Timothy, but they also wanted reassurance that violence would not continue taking lives in their neighborhood. When a homicide occurs in a close community, fear spreads quickly. People begin asking questions about safety. They look at familiar streets differently. They wonder whether something similar could happen again. The shooting of Timothy Heyman Jr. became part of a larger conversation about violence in Charleston. It highlighted concerns that residents had expressed about crime and safety. Community members wanted solutions. They wanted prevention. They wanted fewer families experiencing the same pain. But while public conversations focused on larger issues, investigators remained focused on one specific case. One victim. One night. One sequence of events. The challenge was to transform a tragedy into a complete explanation. As the investigation progressed, detectives also faced legal complications involving statements made during the case. A suspect's words can sometimes become important evidence, but those statements must be obtained according to legal procedures. If proper procedures are not followed, parts of a statement may become difficult or impossible to use in court. For prosecutors, this meant that the strength of the case could not depend on only one piece of evidence. They needed multiple forms of proof. They needed the video. They needed witnesses. They needed physical evidence. They needed a complete chain of events. A strong investigation is not built around one moment. It is built from many details that all point toward the same conclusion. Slowly, the picture became clearer. The argument. The confrontation. The shooting. The departure from the scene. The evidence left behind. The investigation was moving closer to the courtroom. But before justice could be pursued, investigators needed to answer one final question. Did they have enough evidence to prove what happened? Because finding a suspect is only the beginning of the journey. The real test comes when the evidence must speak for itself. And for Timothy Heyman Jr.'s family, the hope was that the truth uncovered by investigators would eventually lead to justice. In the days following the death of Timothy Heyman Jr., investigators faced the difficult task of turning a tragic scene into a complete story. A man had been killed. A confrontation had taken place. A suspect had left the area. But a murder investigation cannot end with assumptions. It cannot be built only on what people believe happened. It must be built on facts that can survive questioning, challenge, and scrutiny. For detectives working on Timothy's case, the breakthrough came from the combination of evidence collected after the shooting. No single piece of information told the entire story. Instead, the truth emerged through a series of details that connected together like pieces of a puzzle. The surveillance footage was one of the most important pieces. In many investigations, the moments before a crime disappear forever. There may be no recording, no clear witnesses, and no way to know exactly how a situation unfolded. But in Timothy Heyman Jr.'s case, a camera captured part of the confrontation that occurred outside his home. The footage provided investigators with something invaluable, a visual timeline. It showed that this was not a random act discovered after the fact. There was an interaction, There was an escalation. There was a moment when the situation crossed from conflict into violence. For detectives, watching the footage meant more than simply observing images. They were studying human behavior. They were looking for movements. They were analyzing reactions. They were examining the sequence of events leading up to the shooting. A few seconds can reveal important information. A person's approach. Their body language. Their distance from another person. The moment a confrontation changes. Every detail mattered. The camera could not reveal every thought or emotion, but it provided a record of what happened externally. And in a homicide investigation, that record can be powerful. Along with the video evidence, investigators continued collecting statements from people connected to the case. Witness testimony can be complicated because people experience traumatic events differently. Two people can witness the same situation and remember different details. One person may focus on the sound of an argument. Another may remember the movements of the people involved. Someone else may remember what happened afterward. Investigators must carefully compare these accounts and determine which details remain consistent. The goal is not simply to collect stories. The goal is to find the truth hidden among those stories. As detectives continued following the evidence, the focus increasingly centered on John Johnson, the man authorities identified as the person responsible for Timothy's death. The arrest represented an important moment in the investigation. For Timothy's family, it meant that the person accused of taking their loved one away would now face the justice system. For investigators, it marked the beginning of another challenge. An arrest is not the conclusion of a homicide case. It is the point where the evidence collected during the investigation must be presented and tested. The courtroom would eventually become the place where every detail would be examined. Every piece of evidence would be questioned. Every decision made during the investigation would be reviewed. And prosecutors knew that the strength of their case would depend on the evidence they could present. One of the complicated aspects of the case involved statements made during the investigation. Statements from suspects can sometimes provide important information, but they must be obtained according to strict legal requirements. If investigators fail to follow proper procedures, a defense attorney may argue that those statements should not be considered. This creates a difficult situation for prosecutors. They cannot rely on a single piece of evidence. They must prepare for challenges. They must build a case strong enough that even if one part becomes uncertain, the overall picture remains clear. That meant relying on the evidence that could not easily be disputed. The surveillance footage. The witness accounts. The physical evidence. The timeline of events. Together, these pieces created a narrative of what happened on Hanover Street. The breakthrough in the case was not just about identifying a suspect. It was about understanding the final moments of Timothy Hayman Jr.'s life. It was about showing how a disagreement became deadly. It was about establishing accountability. But while investigators moved closer to justice, Timothy's family continued living with the emotional consequences of what had happened. An arrest can bring a sense of relief, but it cannot bring back the person who was lost. For families of homicide victims, justice and grief often exist together. They can feel grateful that progress is being made while still feeling the pain of knowing nothing can undo the loss. They may want answers, but answers do not replace the person. They may want accountability, but accountability does not erase memories. They may want the truth, but the truth can still hurt. In the East Side community, the arrest also brought attention back to the larger issue surrounding Timothy's death. Residents continued discussing violence and the need for change. They gathered to remember Timothy. They spoke about the impact of losing another member of their community. They wanted his name to represent more than tragedy. They wanted his life to be remembered. Because when a person becomes the victim of violence, there is always a danger that the details of the crime will overshadow the details of the person. The investigation focused on what happened to Timothy. The community wanted people to remember who Timothy was. A father. A friend. A neighbor. A human being. As the legal process moved forward, the case entered a new stage. The evidence had led investigators to a suspect. The suspect had been arrested. Now the question became whether the evidence would be enough to secure justice. The courtroom would eventually become the place where the story of August 8, 2019, would be examined in front of a judge and jury. The prosecution would present its version of events. The defense would challenge the evidence. The facts would be debated. And after everything was considered, a decision would have to be made. But before that moment arrived, one thing had already become clear. The death of Timothy Heyman Jr. would not remain an unanswered question. The camera had captured part of the truth. The investigation had uncovered more. And the search for justice was moving forward. The breakthrough had come. Now came the fight to prove it. The arrest of John Johnson marked a major turning point in the investigation into the death of Timothy Heyman Jr. For the detectives, who had spent days gathering evidence, following leads, and reconstructing the events of August 8, 2019, the arrest represented the moment when the case moved from investigation to prosecution. But for Timothy's family, an arrest was only the beginning. Because an arrest does not bring someone back. It does not erase the memory of a loved one being taken away. It does not fill the silence left behind. It does not change the fact that a father was no longer there. The next stage of the journey would take place inside a courtroom, where evidence would be examined, arguments would be presented, and the legal system would determine responsibility. The courtroom would become the place where the final moments of Timothy Heyman Jr.'s life were reconstructed in front of strangers. A place where every detail mattered. Every piece of evidence. Every witness statement. Every decision made before and after the shooting. For prosecutors, the challenge was clear. They needed to show the jury exactly what happened on Hanover Street. They needed to transform a collection of evidence into a story that explained how Timothy lost his life, and why John Johnson should be held accountable. The prosecution's case depended heavily on the evidence gathered during the investigation. One of the most important elements was the surveillance footage. The video became a silent witness in the courtroom. It allowed jurors to see parts of the confrontation that occurred before the shooting. Unlike a witness who could forget details or struggle to describe what they saw, the footage provided a recorded sequence of events. It showed the interaction. It showed the movements. It showed the escalation. For prosecutors, the video helped demonstrate the events leading up to Timothy's death. But a courtroom is not only about what happened. It is also about proving what happened according to the standards of law. The defense had the responsibility of challenging the prosecution's interpretation of the evidence. They could question the reliability of witnesses. They could examine the circumstances surrounding the investigation. They could challenge whether every piece of evidence had been properly collected and presented. This is a fundamental part of the justice system. A person accused of a crime has the right to defend themselves. Evidence must be tested. Claims must be examined. The truth must be determined through a fair legal process. For the prosecution, one challenge involved statements connected to the investigation. Statements made by a defendant can sometimes become important evidence, but they must meet legal requirements before they can be used. The defense may argue that certain statements should not be admitted if there are concerns about how they were obtained. Because of this, prosecutors could not depend only on what was said. They needed the stronger foundation of independent evidence. The video, the witness accounts, the physical evidence, the timeline, the details that remained even when individual pieces were questioned. A murder case is often built like a bridge. Each piece of evidence represents a support. Remove one piece, and the entire structure must still stand. For Timothy's case, investigators had worked to create that structure carefully. The evidence told the story of a confrontation that escalated into deadly violence. It showed the events surrounding the shooting and the actions that followed. For Timothy's loved one sitting through the legal process, the experience was likely filled with conflicting emotions. Courtrooms can be painful places for families of victims. They are places where the worst day of their lives is discussed repeatedly. They hear details they wish they had never known. They see evidence connected to the person they lost. They are forced to revisit moments they would rather forget. But they also enter the courtroom because they want something that grief alone cannot provide. Accountability. They want the person responsible to answer for what happened. They want the world to acknowledge that Timothy's life mattered. They want his death to have consequences. As the case moved forward, the story of August 8, 2019, became clearer. The courtroom examination revealed the chain of events that began with a confrontation outside Timothy's home. A disagreement. A moment of escalation. A firearm. A fatal decision. A life lost. A community affected. Every criminal trial carries a larger question beyond the legal outcome. Not only did the crime happen, but also, what does justice look like after something like this? For Timothy's family, justice could never mean returning to the way things were before. No verdict could restore the future they imagined. No sentence could replace the years Timothy should have lived. No courtroom decision could undo the pain of losing a father, a family member, and a friend. But the justice system serves another purpose. It creates accountability. It establishes responsibility. It creates an official record of what happened. And for families of victims, that recognition can carry meaning. The death of Timothy Hayman Jr. was not an accident forgotten by time. It was a crime that demanded answers. It was a loss that deserved acknowledgement. It was a life that deserved to be remembered. As the courtroom proceedings continued, every side presented its arguments. The prosecution worked to show that the evidence connected John Johnson to the shooting. The defense examined the weaknesses and uncertainties within the case. The jury was left with the responsibility of considering everything presented before reaching a decision. In the end, the question before them was simple but heavy. Had the prosecution proven beyond a reasonable doubt that John Johnson was responsible for the death of Timothy Hayman Jr.? A single decision would determine the legal outcome. But regardless of the verdict, one fact could not be changed. Timothy Hayman Jr. was gone. The courtroom could decide guilt. It could decide punishment. But it could not restore the life that had been taken. For the people who loved Timothy, justice was not only about what happened to the person accused. It was also about remembering the person who was lost. A man whose story did not begin with a crime. A father whose life was more than one tragic night. A neighbor whose absence was felt in the community. The legal battle surrounding Timothy Hayman Jr.'s death was ultimately a search for accountability. But behind every argument, every piece of evidence, and every courtroom decision was the same painful reality. A family was still grieving. A community was still healing. And a life that mattered was forever connected to the events of one night on Hanover Street. A murder case does not end when the police investigation is complete. It does not end when an arrest is made. It does not end when a courtroom reaches a decision. For the people who loved the victim, the story continues long after the headlines disappear. The legal process may create an ending for the justice system, but grief does not follow a schedule. For the family of Timothy Heyman Jr., August 8, 2019, became a permanent dividing line. There was life before that night. And there was everything that came afterward. The loss of Timothy was not only the loss of a person. It was the loss of countless future moments that would never happen. A phone call that would never be answered. A conversation that would never take place. A memory that would never be created. When someone dies suddenly through violence, families often struggle with a unique kind of pain. There is no opportunity to prepare. No chance to say goodbye. No time to accept that a final moment is approaching. One moment, a person exists in the world. The next, everyone who loves them must learn how to live without them. For Timothy's family, the pain extended far beyond the night of the shooting. They had to face the difficult reality of rebuilding their lives around an absence that could never be filled. Timothy was a father. That fact carried a special weight. A child losing a parent is not only losing someone from the present. They are losing a connection to the future. They lose the person who would have watched them grow. The person who would have offered advice. The person who would have celebrated their accomplishments. The person who would have been there during difficult moments. Years after a loss, grief often appears in unexpected ways. It can appear during birthdays. During holidays. During ordinary days, when a person suddenly remembers that someone important is missing. The world continues moving, but the people left behind carry the memory of the person who is gone. For the East Side community of Charleston, Timothy's death also represented something larger than one individual tragedy. It became another reminder of the impact of violence on neighborhoods. Communities affected by repeated violence often experience a complicated mixture of emotions. There is sadness because someone has been lost. There is anger because the loss may have been preventable. There is fear because residents wonder whether another tragedy could happen again. And there is frustration because many people feel they have been asking for change for years. After Timothy's death, residents gathered to remember him and to call attention to the issue of violence in their community. The memorial was not only about mourning. It was about recognition. It was about saying that Timothy was more than the circumstances of his death. He was a person whose life had meaning. He was someone whose absence affected real people. The candles, the conversations, and the gathering of neighbors represented a community refusing to let him become just another statistic. Because statistics can hide the human cost of crime. A number cannot show the face of a father. A report cannot describe a person's personality. A news headline cannot capture decades of memories. Behind every homicide statistic is a person whose life had value. And behind every victim is a group of people who must continue living after the tragedy. The case of Timothy Heyman Jr. also raised difficult questions about violence itself. How does an argument become deadly? Why do some people respond to conflict with violence? What causes a person to make a decision that destroys multiple lives at once? These questions do not have simple answers. Violence is often the result of many factors coming together: emotions, choices, circumstances, access to weapons, and moments of poor judgment. But regardless of the explanation, the result remains the same. A person is gone. A family suffers. A community changes. The tragedy of Timothy's death demonstrated how quickly a normal moment can become irreversible. The confrontation outside his home lasted only a short period of time. But its consequences reached far beyond those few minutes. For investigators, the case showed the importance of modern technology and careful police work. The surveillance footage, witness accounts, and collected evidence demonstrated how investigations have changed in the modern era. A camera that happened to be in the right place at the right time became an important part of the search for truth. But technology alone does not solve the deeper questions surrounding violence. A camera can record what happened. It cannot explain why someone chose to do it. It cannot repair the damage afterward. It cannot bring comfort to a child who has lost a parent. It cannot return a person to the family waiting for them. That is why the story of Timothy Hayman Jr. remains about more than the investigation. It is about consequences. It is about the lives affected after the crime scene disappears. It is about the people who must carry memories instead of making new ones. The East Side community continued forward after the tragedy, as communities always do. Children still went to school. People still went to work. Families still gathered. Life continued. But for those who knew Timothy, something was permanently different. There was a missing presence. A familiar voice that could no longer be heard. A person who should have been there but was not. That is the lasting impact of homicide. The moment of violence may be brief, but the absence it creates can last a lifetime. Timothy Hayman Jr.'s story is a reminder that every victim leaves behind more than a name. They leave behind relationships. They leave behind memories. They leave behind people who loved them. And they leave behind questions that may never fully disappear. What if the argument had ended differently? What if someone had walked away? What if one decision had changed? Those questions are often the hardest part of tragedy, because they have no answers. The past cannot be rewritten. The moment cannot be undone. But the memory of Timothy Hayman Jr. can continue. Not only as a victim of violence, but as a father, a friend, a neighbor, a man whose life existed before the tragedy, and whose story deserves to be remembered beyond the night he was killed. The case may eventually leave the courtroom. The investigation may eventually close. The news cycle may eventually move on. But for those closest to Timothy, his story does not end. It continues in the memories of the people who knew him. It continues in the conversations about preventing future violence. It continues in the hope that another family will not have to experience the same pain. Because the true measure of a life is not only how it ended. It is how it was lived. And Timothy Hayman Jr.'s life was much more than the final moments that took him away. Every tragic event leaves behind questions. Some questions are answered through evidence, investigations, and court proceedings. Others remain suspended in the minds of those who were closest to the victim. The case of Timothy Hayman Jr. was no different. Authorities were able to reconstruct much of what happened on Hanover Street. They followed evidence, examined surveillance footage, identified a suspect, and worked toward holding someone accountable. But beyond the legal process, there were deeper questions that continued to haunt those who knew Timothy and those who followed the case. The most difficult question was not only who was responsible. It was how the situation reached that point. How did a disagreement between two people become a moment where a life was taken? How did words become violence? How did a situation that could have ended differently become irreversible? These questions are at the heart of many violent crime investigations, because the final act is often only the last step in a much longer chain of decisions. A shooting may happen in seconds. But the path leading to that moment can be shaped by emotions, circumstances, and choices made before anyone realizes the danger ahead. In Timothy's case, investigators focused on the confrontation that occurred outside his home. A disagreement had developed. The tension increased. The situation escalated. And eventually, a firearm changed everything. The presence of a weapon transformed a conflict into a tragedy. Without that weapon, the argument may have ended with anger. It may have ended with people walking away. It may have become a memory rather than a life-changing event. But when a firearm entered the situation, the possibility of recovery disappeared. This is one of the most difficult realities surrounding violent crime. Many tragedies do not begin with a plan to destroy a life. They begin with a moment. A reaction. A decision made under intense emotion. A choice that cannot be reversed. For investigators and community leaders, understanding these moments is essential, because preventing violence requires understanding how it begins. A community cannot only respond after a person is killed. It must also examine the circumstances that allow conflicts to become deadly. The death of Timothy Heyman Jr. became part of a larger conversation about violence in Charleston. Residents of the East Side had already expressed concerns about safety in their neighborhood. They wanted more than arrests after crimes happened. They wanted prevention. They wanted solutions that could protect people before tragedy occurred. Because for communities affected by violence, justice is only one part of healing. There is also the question of how to stop the next tragedy. How to prevent another family from receiving the same devastating phone call. How to prevent another street from becoming a crime scene. How to prevent another person from becoming a name remembered because of violence. The story of Timothy also highlights the complexity of human behavior during conflict. Most people experience anger. Most people experience frustration. Most people have moments when emotions become intense. But most people also have moments where they choose to stop. They choose to leave. They choose not to cross a line. The difference between a confrontation and a tragedy can sometimes come down to one decision made in a single moment. That reality is difficult to accept, because it means a different choice could have changed everything. For Timothy's family, this possibility likely carried enormous emotional weight. They were not only grieving the person they lost. They were grieving the future that was taken from them. They were grieving the possibility of what Timothy's life could have become. At 41 years old, Timothy still had years ahead of him. Years to watch his daughter grow. Years to create memories. Years to experience ordinary moments that are often taken for granted. Violence did not only take away the present. It took away the future. This is why the aftermath of homicide extends far beyond the immediate victim. A single act can affect dozens of lives. Family members. Friends. Neighbors. Witnesses. First responders. Even investigators, who spend years handling difficult cases, can carry the emotional weight of what they see. Everyone connected to the event experiences its impact differently. For some, the memory appears in moments of silence. For others, it appears in anger. For others, it appears in a determination to create change. In the East Side community, Timothy's death became a reminder that behind every violent incident is a person whose life mattered. It also became a reminder that communities are not defined only by their tragedies. They are defined by how they respond afterward. The gatherings held in Timothy's memory showed that people wanted to honor him. They wanted his name connected not only with the crime committed against him, but with the life he lived. They wanted people to remember the man before the tragedy. The father. The friend. The neighbor. The person who had his own dreams and experiences. True crime stories often focus naturally on the investigation. The suspect. The evidence. The courtroom. The verdict. But there is another story happening at the same time. The story of those left behind. The story of families learning how to live with loss. The story of communities trying to understand something that feels impossible. The story of people searching for meaning after violence takes something away. Timothy Heyman Jr.'s case also demonstrates how modern investigations have changed. A surveillance camera captured part of what happened. Digital information helped investigators build a clearer picture. Technology became a tool in the search for justice. But technology has limits. A camera can show a moment. It cannot prevent that moment from happening. It cannot warn someone before anger becomes dangerous. It cannot bring back the person who was lost. That responsibility belongs to people. To the choices they make. To the way conflicts are handled. To the value placed on human life. The tragedy of Timothy Heyman Jr. forces us to look at the space between ordinary life and devastating violence. That space can be smaller than people imagine. A few words. A few seconds. A single decision. And suddenly, everything changes. The investigation answered many questions about what happened on Hanover Street. But the deeper questions remain. How can communities prevent these moments? How can people recognize when conflict is moving toward danger? How can society create an environment where walking away becomes the easier choice than causing harm? There are no simple answers. But asking these questions matters. Because every person lost to violence represents more than one tragedy. They represent a family changed forever. A community forced to mourn. A future that will never happen. Timothy Heyman Jr.'s story is ultimately a story about the consequences of one moment. A moment that lasted only seconds. But created pain that would last for years. And as Charleston continued moving forward, the memory of what happened on Hanover Street remained as a reminder of a simple, but powerful truth. A life can take decades to build. But it can be taken away in an instant. In the aftermath of a violent crime, there is always a danger that the victim becomes remembered only through the tragedy that took their life. A name appears in a report. A face appears in a news story. A date becomes connected to a terrible event. But a person's existence cannot be measured by the final moments they experienced. Timothy Heyman Jr. was more than the circumstances surrounding his death. Before investigators searched for evidence, before a courtroom examined the case, before the community gathered in grief, Timothy was simply a man living his life. He had routines. He had relationships. He had responsibilities. He had people who cared about him. And those are the details that remain most important when remembering him. For his family, Timothy's legacy was not defined by the gunshot that ended his life. It was defined by the years before that moment. The conversations. The laughter. The memories. The everyday moments that may have seemed ordinary at the time, but later became priceless. When someone dies suddenly, families often hold tightly to those small memories, because they are the remaining pieces of the person they lost. A favorite expression. A familiar voice. A habit that made them unique. A story that only family members know. These are the things that keep a person present even after they are gone. For Timothy's daughter, his memory represented more than a painful loss. It represented a connection to someone who should have been there for the important chapters of her life. A father's role is built through time. Through guidance. Through support. Through presence. Those moments cannot be replaced. And that is one of the deepest wounds caused by violent crime. The person who is taken away is not only removed from the present. They are removed from the future. Timothy would never have the chance to experience the years ahead. He would never see how his daughter changed and grew. He would never create new memories with his family. He would never have the opportunity to become older, wiser, and continue the story that had been interrupted. The loss was permanent. But the memory remained. Within the East Side community, Timothy's death also became part of a larger conversation about the impact of violence. Communities affected by repeated violence often carry invisible wounds. People may continue living their daily lives, but the experience changes how they view their surroundings. A street that once felt familiar may suddenly feel different. A sound in the distance may create fear. A gathering of neighbors may carry sadness, because everyone understands why they are there. The memorial held for Timothy reflected those emotions. People came together not because they wanted to focus only on how he died, but because they wanted to recognize that he had lived. They wanted to say that his name represented a person, not just a case. They wanted his story to include more than the crime. That desire is common among families and communities affected by homicide. They want justice, but they also want remembrance. They want accountability, but they also want humanity. Because a victim should never disappear behind the details of an investigation. The legal system often requires people to focus on evidence. Dates. Locations. Actions. Statements. Those details are necessary to establish the truth. But behind every fact is a human experience. Behind every crime scene is a family. Behind every investigation is someone who lost a person they loved. The case of Timothy Heyman Jr. also became a reminder of the importance of community involvement in addressing violence. Law enforcement can investigate crimes after they happen. Courts can determine responsibility. But preventing violence requires more than arrests and trials. It requires communities working together. It requires conversations about conflict, safety, and responsibility. It requires recognizing warning signs before they become tragedies. Because once violence happens, the damage cannot be fully undone. No sentence can restore the years lost. No verdict can return a loved one. No courtroom decision can erase the pain carried by those left behind. Justice matters. But prevention matters too. For the people who knew Timothy, the hope was not only that the person responsible would be held accountable. The hope was that his death would not become meaningless. That something could be learned. That another family would not have to experience the same loss. That another child would not have to grow up without a parent, because of a moment of violence. This is often the difficult question left after tragedy. What can come from something so painful? The answer is never simple. Nothing can make the loss acceptable. Nothing can make the pain disappear. But remembering victims can create awareness. Telling their stories can remind people that behind every statistic is a real human being. A person who had dreams. A person who had loved ones. A person who mattered. Timothy Heyman Jr.'s story is important because it shows the difference between seeing someone as a victim and remembering them as a person. The word victim describes what happened to someone. It does not describe everything they were. Timothy was a father. He was someone who worked. He was someone who built relationships. He was someone whose presence mattered to others. His life existed before August 8, 2019. And that life deserves to be remembered. As time passed after the shooting, Charleston continued to move forward. The streets changed. People returned to their routines. The immediate attention surrounding the case faded. But for those closest to Timothy, the passage of time did not mean forgetting. Grief does not disappear because the calendar moves. It changes. It becomes something people learn to carry. Some days are easier. Some days bring back memories unexpectedly. A photograph. A familiar place. A story someone tells. A reminder that the person they loved once stood beside them. That is the lasting impact of losing someone to violence. The person may no longer be physically present, but their influence remains through the people they touched. Through the memories they created. Through the lives they changed. The story of Timothy Heyman Jr. began with a tragedy. But it should not end there. Because his life was more than the way it ended. His story is also about the people who loved him. The community that remembered him. And the importance of recognizing that every life lost to violence represents a world of experiences that can never be replaced. A person is not just the final moment of their life. They are every moment that came before. And Timothy Heyman Jr. was 41 years of moments. 41 years of memories. 41 years of being someone's son, someone's friend, someone's father. That is the legacy that remains. In every homicide investigation, there is a moment when scattered pieces begin to form a complete picture. At the beginning, investigators often face uncertainty. They arrive at a scene where something terrible has happened, but they do not yet know the full story. They do not know every decision that led to the violence. They do not know every person involved. They do not know what happened in the moments before and after the crime. They only know that someone's life has been taken. For the investigators handling the death of Timothy Heyman Jr., the path toward the truth depended on carefully connecting every available piece of evidence. The shooting on Hanover Street happened quickly. The confrontation. The escalation. The gunshot. The departure from the scene. But the investigation moved in the opposite direction. Slowly. Carefully. Methodically. Detectives had to slow down time. They had to examine the seconds that changed everything and understand how those seconds unfolded. The surveillance footage became one of the most important tools in that process. A camera that had recorded part of the encounter provided investigators with a perspective that witnesses alone could not provide. It captured movement. It preserved timing. It allowed investigators to return to the moment again and again. For detectives, reviewing video evidence is not simply watching a recording. It is analyzing behavior. A person's actions before a crime can reveal important information. The way someone approaches another person. The way they react during an argument. The way they move afterward. These details become pieces of a larger story. The footage helped investigators understand the relationship between the people involved during those final moments. It showed that the incident did not happen without warning. There was an interaction before the violence. There was a confrontation. There was a progression that eventually led to a fatal outcome. That distinction was important. Because understanding the events before a crime can help determine not only what happened but why. Investigators also relied on witness information. People who lived nearby or were in the area became important parts of the investigation. In communities where violent crimes happen, witnesses often face difficult choices. They may be afraid. They may be uncertain about what they saw. They may worry about becoming involved. But their information can be critical. A single observation can help confirm a timeline. A single detail can connect one piece of evidence to another. A single memory can help investigators understand what happened when no camera was present. The process requires patience. Detectives must compare statements. They must look for consistency. They must separate what someone knows from what someone assumes. The goal is not simply to find information. The goal is to find reliable information. As the investigation developed, the evidence increasingly pointed toward John Johnson as the person accused of killing Timothy Hayman Jr. But identifying a suspect was only one part of the process. Investigators also needed to understand the actions after the shooting. The decision to leave the scene became another important element. In criminal investigations, what happens after a crime can provide valuable information. A person's actions afterward may reveal awareness, fear, or an attempt to avoid responsibility. Leaving the location of a shooting creates questions. Where did the person go? What did they do next? Why did they leave instead of remaining at the scene? These questions became part of the broader investigation. At the same time, prosecutors had to consider how every piece of evidence would hold up in court. A successful prosecution requires more than a strong belief that someone is responsible. It requires evidence that can withstand challenge. Defense attorneys are expected to question the investigation. They examine procedures. They challenge interpretations. They look for uncertainty. That process is not a weakness of the justice system. It is a necessary part of ensuring that decisions are based on evidence. Because the consequences of a criminal conviction are serious, the justice system must carefully examine both sides. For Timothy's family, however, the legal process represented something deeply personal. They were not studying evidence from a distance. They were living with the consequences of the crime every day. Every court appearance. Every new development. Every discussion of the case reopened the reality that Timothy was gone. The investigation could explain what happened. But it could not explain away the pain. It could identify a suspect. But it could not replace a father. It could build a case. But it could not rebuild a family's life exactly as it was before. This is the emotional reality behind every homicide investigation. The evidence tells the story of the crime. But the family carries the story of the loss. As investigators continued building the case, the evidence became stronger. The surveillance footage. The witness accounts. The collected information. The timeline. Together, they created a clearer picture of what happened on Hanover Street. The unknown became known. The questions began receiving answers. The investigation that started with uncertainty moved closer to justice. But even when investigators uncover the truth, there is another reality that remains. Truth does not always bring peace immediately. Sometimes, knowing exactly what happened can create another form of pain. Families may finally understand the events surrounding a loved one's death, but understanding does not mean accepting. It does not make the loss easier. It does not erase the final moments. It does not bring back the person who should still be alive. For Timothy Hayman Jr.'s loved ones, the truth was necessary. They deserved answers. They deserved accountability. They deserved recognition that what happened mattered. But they also deserved to remember Timothy as more than the victim of a crime. The investigation revealed how he died. The memories of those who knew him reveal how he lived. Both stories matter. The evidence tells one part of the story. The people who loved him tell another. Together, they create the complete picture of Timothy Hayman Jr. A man whose final moments became the focus of a criminal investigation, but whose entire life represented far more than those final moments. As the case moved toward its conclusion, one final stage remained. The courtroom would decide how justice would be carried out. The evidence gathered on Hanover Street would be presented. The arguments would be made. The responsibility would be determined. And the legal system would attempt to provide an answer to a question that had remained since that night. Who would be held accountable for the death of Timothy Heyman Jr.? The courtroom represents a place where stories are examined. Not the stories people tell themselves. Not the rumors that spread through communities. Not the assumptions formed in the days after a crime. A courtroom demands something different. It demands evidence. It demands facts. It demands a careful examination of what can be proven. For the family of Timothy Heyman Jr., the courtroom was where the final chapter of the investigation would unfold. The night of August 8, 2019, had already taken something from them that could never be returned. No verdict could change that. No punishment could bring Timothy back. But the legal process offered something that every family affected by homicide searches for. Accountability. The opportunity for the person responsible to answer for their actions. The opportunity for the truth to be officially recognized. The opportunity for Timothy's name to be connected not only with tragedy, but with justice. As the case moved forward, prosecutors prepared to present the evidence collected during the investigation. Their responsibility was to explain the chain of events that led to Timothy's death. They had to take moments scattered across time and present them as one complete narrative. The confrontation. The shooting. The evidence afterward. The identification of the person accused. The investigation that followed. A jury would not experience the night the way investigators had. They were not there. They did not hear every sound. They did not witness every movement. They did not know Timothy before that moment. Instead, they had to understand the case through the evidence presented before them. The surveillance footage became one of the most significant parts of that presentation. The video provided a window into the moments before violence occurred. It allowed jurors to examine the sequence of events and consider how the confrontation developed. For the prosecution, the footage was important because it supported the timeline established during the investigation. It showed the interaction between Timothy and the other man involved. It showed the circumstances surrounding the shooting. And it helped demonstrate the events that followed. But a criminal trial is never decided by one piece of evidence alone. Every detail must work together. Every witness. Every record. Every piece of information collected by investigators. A strong case is not created by a single moment. It is created by the relationship between many moments. The prosecution also had to address challenges involving statements connected to the investigation. Questions about how statements are obtained can become important during criminal proceedings. The defense may argue that certain evidence should not be considered if legal procedures were not properly followed. Because of this, prosecutors must prepare for every possibility. They must build their case around evidence that remains strong even when challenged. The focus returns again and again to the same foundation. What can be proven? What can be supported? What can be shown clearly? The defense, meanwhile, had the responsibility of protecting the rights of the accused. That meant questioning the prosecution's evidence and examining whether every conclusion was justified. A courtroom allows both sides to present their arguments, because justice requires more than reaching a quick conclusion. It requires a process. For those watching from outside the courtroom, the legal arguments may appear distant. But for Timothy's family, every detail carried emotional weight. The trial was not simply about evidence. It was about someone they loved. It was about a person whose absence they continued to feel every day. Every mention of Timothy brought back the reality of what had happened. The courtroom became another place where his name was spoken. Another place where his story was told. Another place where people were reminded that behind every piece of evidence was a human life. When the jury considered the case, they were not only deciding what happened during a confrontation. They were deciding whether the evidence proved responsibility beyond a reasonable doubt. That standard exists because the consequences of a criminal conviction are permanent. The justice system requires certainty based on evidence, not emotion. After considering the information presented, the legal process reached its conclusion. The person accused of taking Timothy Hayman Jr.'s life was held accountable through the court system. The verdict represented the end of one journey. But it did not represent the end of the story. Because justice and healing are not the same thing. A verdict can answer legal questions. It can determine responsibility. It can provide a sense of closure. But it cannot remove grief. It cannot erase memories of what was lost. It cannot restore the future Timothy should have had. For his family, the conclusion of the case likely carried many emotions at once. There may have been relief that accountability had been achieved. There may have been sadness, because the outcome still could not change reality. There may have been exhaustion, after a process that required them to repeatedly revisit the most painful moment of their lives. That is the complicated nature of justice after murder. A courtroom can deliver a decision. But families must continue living afterward. They must continue carrying memories. They must continue finding ways to move forward. The community of Charleston also continued its own process of healing. The case had drawn attention to the concerns surrounding violence in the East Side neighborhood. It reminded residents that behind every statistic was a person. A family. A community affected forever. The story of Timothy Hayman Jr. became part of a larger conversation about preventing future tragedies. Because after every homicide, people ask the same difficult questions. Could this have been prevented? Could someone have intervened? Could one decision have changed the outcome? Those questions often remain unanswered. The past cannot be rewritten. The final moments cannot be changed. But the lessons learned from tragedy can influence the future. The case demonstrated the importance of evidence in modern investigations. Surveillance technology played a crucial role. Digital information helped investigators build a clearer timeline. Traditional detective work combined with modern tools to reveal what happened. But perhaps the most important lesson was not about technology. It was about the value of human life. A person was lost. A family was changed. A community was forced to mourn. The legal system reached its conclusion, but Timothy Hayman Jr.'s story continued through the people who remembered him. Because a victim's story should never end with the crime. It should continue through the impact they had. Through the memories they left behind. Through the lives they touched. The verdict could determine what happened to the person accused. But Timothy's legacy belonged to those who knew him. To those who loved him. To those who refused to let his life be reduced to one terrible night. The final chapter of the courtroom had been written. But the story of Timothy Hayman Jr. was never only about how he died. It was always about who he was.